The first time anyone noticed Daniel doing something unusual, it was early October, when the air had just started to sharpen, and the mornings carried that thin silver frost that melts by noon. The mountain town was used to routine, smoke rising from chimneys, pickup trucks warming up in driveways, the steady knock of wood being split behind cabins that had stood for decades. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew how winter worked. And everyone believed they understood cold. Daniel, as Kevin sat slightly apart from the others, not isolated enough to be mysterious, but far enough that people noticed when something changed. It was a modest structure timber frame, pitched roof, small porch with a single rocking chair that creaked even when no one sat in it. He had bought it 3 years ago, and, unlike most newcomers, he hadn't tried to modernize it. No flashy upgrades, no solar panels, no dramatic renovations. He kept to himself, polite nods at the general store, short conversations, paid in cash. That morning, though, instead of stacking firewood like the others, Daniel was unloading long planks of treated lumber from his truck, not a few boards, a full load, thick beams, rolls of insulation, sheets of weather barrier, boxes of screws, the kind of materials you buy when you not patching something but building something. Old Mr. Harper from across the gravel road was the first to wander over, hands tucked into his jacket. Roof leaking? He asked casually. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans. No. Adding a room? No. Harper squinted at the lumber, then at the cabin walls. Then what is all this for? Daniel looked at the cabin for a moment, like he was measuring it in his mind. I am building a second wall. Harper blinked. A what? A second wall. Around the cabin. There was a pause long enough for a gust of wind to sweep dry leaves across the yard. You mean like siding? No, an actual wall. Harper laughed. It wasn't cruel, at first just confused. Son, you already got 4. Daniel only smiled faintly and went back to work. By noon, 2 more neighbors had heard about it. By evening, half the street knew. By the next morning, people were deliberately slowing their trucks just to stare. He began by marking a perimeter line about 1.5 feet away from the existing exterior walls. The gap was deliberate, measured carefully, not random. He dug shallow footings, set posts, framed outward, creating a skeleton structure that mirrored the shape of his cabin but slightly larger, slightly detached. It looked strange, like a house wearing a wooden cage. Children walking home from school stopped to point. Is he building a barn over his house? One of them asked. Maybe he is scared of bears, another suggested. At the diner that evening, the subject came up between bites of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. He is wasting money, said Carl, who prided himself on surviving 30 winters in that valley. You done, beat cold with extra walls. You beat it with a good stove. He ain't even running his stove much yet, someone added. I passed by at night, chimneys barely smoking. Well, he'll learn, Carl muttered. First real freeze, he'll be burning through wood like the rest of us. They all nodded, satisfied. Outside, Daniel worked late. The rhythmic thud of his hammer echoed across the quiet evening. He moved methodically, not rushed. He checked levels twice, adjusted angles, sealed joints carefully. It wasn't the frantic energy of someone improvising. It was the calm focus of someone executing a plan already built in his head. As days passed, the structure took shape. Vertical studs, horizontal supports, cross-bracing, the outline of a second shell forming around the first. People began to openly comment when passing by. You starting a fortress? You expecting a hurricane up here? You know it gets cold every year, right? We've managed. Daniel would pause, offer a small nod, and return to fastening boards. What made it stranger was what he was doing. He was increasing his firewood pile. In fact, compared to others, his stack looked modest. He was installing a larger stove. No new chimney. No visible generator. No propane tank delivery. Just that widening wooden frame slowly enclosing his cabin like a shadow growing thicker. By mid-October, the gap between the original cabin wall and the new outer wall was clearly visible. Roughly 18 inches all the way around. An intentional air channel. Dead space. Carl scoffed when he came close enough to examine it. Cold air is going to sit in there and freeze you solid. Daniel glanced at him. Or at 1T, Carl shook his head. You can't trap cold out there and expect it to behave. Daniel did argue. He simply measured another beam and secured it into place. The laughter became less curious and more amused. At the general store, someone joked. Maybe he thinks the cold one notice if there's 2 walls. Yeah, another replied. Maybe it'll knock on the first one and leave. Even the store owner chuckled. Daniel heard some of it. It traveled easily in a small town, but he never reacted. If anything, the mockery seemed to make him quieter, more focused. One afternoon, Mrs. Whitaker, who rarely involved herself in gossip, walked up his driveway with a pie wrapped in a towel. "I figured you might need something warm," she said gently. "Thank you," Daniel replied, accepting it. She studied the half-built outer wall. "You, Don, have to explain it to me. But does it really make that much difference?" He looked at the space between the two walls, where sunlight slipped in narrow bands. "It will," he said simply. She nodded, though she clearly did understand how. By late October, the outer wall was fully framed, sheathed, wrapped in protective barrier. It stood solid, separate yet surrounding, leaving only small controlled openings near the base and top that Daniel carefully adjusted with vents. Now it looked less like a cage and more like a second cabin hugging the first. The jokes did stop, but they shifted. "Guess he is serious. Must have cost him a fortune. Watch, he'll still be freezing come January." The first real frost came early that year. White crystals formed thick along rooftops. The river near the edge of town began forming thin sheets of ice overnight. Breath lingered longer in the air. Cabin lights glowed earlier each evening. Daniel finished sealing the outer wall just as temperatures began dropping below zero at night. He added insulation, strategically not thick bats crammed everywhere, but layered sections combined with the air gap. He sealed joints meticulously to control airflow. He wasn't just building another barrier. He was shaping how air would move, and that was something no one else in town was thinking about. They believed in heat as force. Burn more wood. Turn up the thermostat. Feed the fire. Daniel seemed to believe in heat as something to be kept, not chased. The last day before November, a strong wind swept down from the mountains. It rattled loose shutters, whistled through gaps in older cabins. You could hear the strain in aging wood. Neighbors stepped outside to secure tarps and check chimneys. Daniel stood on his porch, watching the wind press against his new outer wall. It shuddered slightly, then steadied. The air gap between the two structures seemed almost invisible now, but purposeful. From the road, Carl shouted over the wind, "Hope that thing holds." Daniel gave a thumbs up. When night fell, temperatures dipped hard. Inside their cabins, people fed their stoves earlier than usual. Across the gravel road, Daniel's chimney released only a thin ribbon of smoke. Carl noticed. He frowned slightly. Strange, he muttered to himself, because already, even before winter had fully arrived, something felt different. The air inside Daniel's cabin one's tea escaping in visible bursts every time he opened his door. The frost did. Tea clinged to his windows as thickly in the mornings. Snow that landed against the outer wall did. Tea immediately melt, but it also did tea press cold directly against the inner structure. The space between the walls remained still, controlled. But from the outside, all anyone saw was wood. Extra wood, unnecessary wood. And in that small mountain town, tradition ran deeper than curiosity. They had survived winters the same way for decades. Wood stove, thick blankets, patience. What Daniel was doing was to just construction. It was a quiet challenge to the way things had always been done. And people did tea like that. So they laughed, they shook their heads, they predicted his failure. What they did see was the way Daniel paused each evening, stepping back to look at his work not with doubt, but with quiet certainty. Winter hadn't. Tea even truly begun. And already, the town believed they knew how this story would end. They were wrong. Long before anyone in town noticed the second wall rising around his cabin, the idea had already been living in Daniel's mind for years. It hadn't started in the mountains. It hadn't even started in winter. It began in a university lab filled with metal ducts, temperature gauges, and walls cut open to reveal their insides like anatomy diagrams. Years ago, Daniel had worked in building performance analysis, studying how structures breathed, how heat moved, how energy escaped, without anyone realizing it. While most people thought of walls as solid barriers, he had learned they were more like filters. They allowed heat to drift outward, cold to creep inward, moisture to settle where it shouldn't. Tea buildings were and tea static. They were systems, and most systems leaked. He had spent months running thermal imaging cameras across model homes. On the screens, heat appeared in bright yellows and reds, bleeding out of corners, slipping through studs, seeping through poorly sealed joints. Even well-insulated. Houses lost energy constantly. The numbers were small in isolation but relentless over time. He remembered one test in particular, 2 identical wooden structures built side by side. Same dimensions, same materials, same heater inside both. But one had a secondary outer shell installed with a controlled air gap between the walls. The difference had stunned even the professors. The double shell model retained interior warmth dramatically longer once the heater was turned off. The air gap still, unmoving, acted like a buffer zone, not because it was filled with expensive insulation, not because it was complicated, but because it disrupted the direct pathway for thermal transfer. Heat always moves toward cold. That was physics. But how quickly it moves depends on resistance. Most cabins in his mountain town relied on thick logs or standard insulation stuffed between studs. But they were still single-envelope structures. The exterior wall faced the full force of winter wind and sub-zero air. Once cold penetrated the outer layer, it pressed directly against the insulation and inner wall. The temperature gradient was sharp and unforgiving. Daniel had learned that if you widened that gradient, if you forced cold to cross an additional boundary before reaching the living space, you slowed everything down. You did. Fight winter harder. You made winter take the long way around. After leaving his job years ago, burned out by corporate cost-cutting that prioritized cheaper materials over smarter design, Daniel had moved to the mountains seeking quiet. He bought the small cabin knowing full well it was perfect. The first winter there had taught him what the thermal camera already knew. He could feel heat escaping. Even with the stove burning steadily, the corners cooled faster. Floors near the outer walls felt colder than the center of the room. On windy nights, slight drafts slipped through outlets and window seams. The cabin was failing. It was behaving exactly like every single wall structure does. That first winter, when temperatures dipped below -10, he had performed a simple experiment. One evening, he let the stove burn down to embers before bed. Normally, by morning, the interior would feel sharp and brittle with cold. But that night, he placed temporary foam panels outside 2 sections of the exterior wall, leaving a small gap between the panels and the wood. Crude, improvised, barely secured. In the morning, the interior temperature drop was noticeably slower along those sections. It was subtle, but measurable. That was when the idea stopped being theoretical. Still, he did act on it immediately. He spent another year observing, tracking heating patterns, measuring wood consumption, calculating how much thermal energy the stove produced versus how much was lost overnight. He was obsessive, just thorough. Most evenings, while others watched television, Daniel sketched diagrams at his kitchen table. He drew cross-sections of walls, airflow arrows, wind pressure points. He studied how barns and older European stone homes handled winter. Many historical structures unknowingly used layered envelopes, thick exterior shells, with interior living quarters slightly separated. Modern construction had simplified walls for cost and speed, but sometimes simplicity sacrificed resilience. When he finally decided to build the second wall, it was a spontaneous reaction to cold. It was a controlled decision backed by years of quiet analysis. He knew the town would misunderstand. From the outside, it would look excessive. From inside his mind, it was efficient. The key was just adding material. Anyone could nail more boards onto a cabin. The real concept lay in the air gap itself. Still, air is one of the best insulators available. When air moves, it carries heat away convection. When it stays still, it slows heat transfer dramatically. That was why double-pane windows worked. 2 layers of glass with sealed air between them performed far better than 1 thick pane. He was simply scaling that concept to an entire structure. The outer wall would take the brunt of wind and snowfall. It would cool rapidly during storms, but that cold would sit primarily in the outer shell. The inner cabin wall would experience a moderated temperature, buffered by the trapped air zone, and because he carefully controlled ventilation openings at the base and top of the gap, he could reduce unwanted convection currents inside that space. Too sealed, and moisture could build up. Too open, and cold air would circulate freely. Balance was everything. He chose materials deliberately not the most expensive, but durable. Treated lumber for framing, weather-resistant sheathing. Strategic insulation in specific zones, but not overpacked. Over-insulation without airflow control often trapped moisture and caused rot. He'd seen it happen in countless inspections. When Mr. Harper had first asked him what he was building, Daniel had almost explained the physics. But he stopped himself. Because explanation would change perception. In small towns, tradition outweighs theory. People trust what has worked for them, and wood stoves had worked for generations. He did. He wanted to argue against stoves. He simply wanted to reduce dependency on constant fuel consumption. He had calculated something most of them hadn't: how much energy escaped every night through conduction and air leakage. Even a small percentage difference compounded across weeks of sub-zero temperatures meant stacks of extra firewood burned unnecessarily. His second wall was about luxury. It was about reducing loss. Heat, once generated, should stay. That principle had shaped ancient architecture long before electric heaters existed. Thick adobe walls in deserts, double stone layers in cold climates. Even igloos used trapped air within snow blocks to maintain internal warmth far above outside temperatures. Nature favored layers. Single barriers rarely performed best against extremes. As he built, he constantly adjusted measurements. The gap had to remain consistent, wide enough to create a meaningful thermal buffer, narrow enough to avoid structural waste. Around 18 inches proved ideal for his cabin size and local wind patterns. He angled small vent openings to prevent direct wind from blasting into the gap. He reinforced corners where pressure differentials would be strongest during storms. He sealed joints not just against rain, but against uncontrolled air infiltration. Every nail had intention. Every seam mattered. At night, when he stepped inside the cabin and closed the door, he imagined winter winds hitting the outer wall first, losing force, losing temperature, losing direct access to the living space. He was building a bunker. He was building resistance. And perhaps what frustrated him most was the laughter, but the assumption that innovation meant excess. When Carl had said, "You don't beat cold with extra walls," Daniel had almost responded, "You don't beat cold at all. You slow it down." That distinction was everything. He had seen too many homeowners increase heater capacity instead of improving envelopes. It was like pouring more water into a leaking bucket rather than fixing the leak. Add a bigger stove and you simply burn more wood, reduce the leak, and the same stove works better. Simple, but invisible. The town measured preparedness by woodpile height. Daniel measured it by thermal retention. As November approached and temperatures began flirting with zero, he completed airflow tests. Standing inside the air gap on a still evening, he lit a small strip of incense and watched the smoke drift. It moved slowly upward toward the vent openings near the roofline, controlled, not chaotic. Good. That meant convection inside the cavity was minimal. Minimal movement meant minimal heat transfer. Inside the cabin, he ran one final trial. He heated the space to a comfortable temperature, then extinguished the stove earlier than usual. He monitored interior drop over several hours. The decline curve was noticeably gentler than the previous year. Proof. Not dramatic enough for a town demonstration, but enough for him. What the neighbors did, T understand, was that his goal was to create tropical warmth in a snowstorm. It was stability. If outside temperatures plunged suddenly overnight, his cabin would mirror that drop immediately. The inner wall would be insulated not just by material but by time. And time mattered. Slower cooling meant less fuel burned, less stress on pipes, less risk of sudden freezes. Resilience one's loud. It was steady. He anticipated the cold wave forecasts long before they arrived. He followed regional weather patterns, jet stream shifts, Arctic air mass movements. He knew that particular winter was predicted to be harsher than average. But even if it was the wall would still perform. When people drove by and shook their heads, Daniel felt no irritation, only a quiet awareness that they were seeing surface, not system. He did expect them to change their homes immediately. He only needed one winter to prove the concept, and as the final panels went up and the outer shell enclosed his cabin fully, he stepped back not with pride but with relief. The design was complete. Now physics would take over. Winter would test it. And winter, unlike neighbors, did not laugh. Winter simply applied pressure. Daniel had spent years studying how structures responded to that pressure. Now his own cabin would answer. By the time December arrived, the mountains had already changed their tone. What had been a sharp chill in November turned into something heavier, thicker in the air, quieter in sound. Snow did fall in dramatic storms at first. It settled gradually, layer by layer, like winter was testing the ground before committing to it. Mornings came slower. Sunlight felt weaker. Smoke from chimneys rose straight up on still days, but on windy ones it bent low and flat, dragged sideways by cold gusts that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The first real freeze came overnight. Puddles hardened into glass. The gravel road turned stiff beneath tires. Breath became visible even inside unheated sheds. Windows across town grew delicate patterns of frost along their edges, white veins spreading inward like frozen lightning. Inside the cabins, stoves began burning earlier in the evenings. Carl woke before dawn that morning and fed his firebox heavily. The wood caught fast, flames licking upward, pushing warmth back into the room. He had done this routine every winter for decades. There was comfort in it, predictability, control. Across the road, Daniel's cabin chimney released only a thin thread of smoke. Carl noticed. He frowned slightly but shrugged it off. Early season cold was manageable. No reason to judge yet. By mid-December, temperatures began dropping below zero at night more consistently. The weather reports mentioned a polar front dipping south earlier than expected. Wind speeds were predicted to increase. Coldest stretch in years, one announcer said casually. The town reacted the way it always did: more wood stacked by doors, propane tanks checked, extra blankets laid out. Generators were tested. People compared notes at the general store. You ready for it? Someone asked Carl. Been ready for 30 winters, he replied. When someone mentioned Daniel's second wall again, the group chuckled. Guess we'll see if his wooden sandwich works. That night, the temperature fell to -5. The kind of cold that makes metal sting to the touch. Inside most cabins, heaters ran continuously. Wood stoves roared brighter and longer. You could hear the crackle of burning logs even from outside if you walked close enough. Windows fogged up from interior warmth meeting frigid glass. In some homes, condensation froze at the corners by morning. In Daniel's cabin, the stove burned as usual but not excessively. He did tea-feed it aggressively. He let it maintain steady warmth rather than spike high heat. The interior temperature sat comfortably in the low 20s Celsius. What changed was dramatic. It was subtle. When wind gusts slammed against the outer wall, the inner cabin walls did. Tea trembled the same way they had the year before. The sound was muffled. The force diffused. The air gap absorbed impact like a cushion. He walked slowly around the inside perimeter that evening, placing his palm lightly against sections of the inner wall. Cooler near corners, but not biting cold. Stable. He extinguished the stove slightly earlier than his neighbors likely did, not recklessly, just experimentally. Then he sat at his small kitchen table and listened. Outside, wind howled against wood. Inside, the air remained calm. By morning, the interior temperature had dropped, but gently, not sharply, not drastically. Across town, however, smaller problems began appearing. Mrs. Whitaker's kitchen pipes froze for the first time in years. She hadn't kept her faucet dripping overnight, assuming the early season freeze would be severe enough. It took half the morning and a careful application of warm cloths to restore flow. 2 cabins down, a draft near an electrical outlet made the living room noticeably colder along one wall. They stuffed towels against the baseboards. Carl's stove burned nearly nonstop for 3 days straight as the cold deepened. His wood pile shrank faster than he preferred this early in the season. He muttered about it while splitting more logs in his yard, each swing of the axe punctuated by white clouds of breath. Cold as settling in hard, he said to no one in particular. The next wave hit before anyone fully adjusted. A strong Arctic system pushed through overnight, accompanied by wind that screamed through the valley. Snow did fall gently anymore. It blew sideways, rattling against siding like thrown sand. Drifts formed against doors. The river's surface stiffened completely. Temperature, -10. Then -12. Then -15. Kind of numbers that shift from uncomfortable to dangerous. Inside cabins, the difference between rooms became more noticeable. Spaces closer to exterior walls cooled faster. Floors near doorways felt like stone. People layered sweaters indoors. Thermostats were adjusted upward. Wood consumption doubled. Generators hummed in a few yards as supplemental heaters were plugged in. Daniel observed the storm from his small front window. Snow accumulated against the outer wall first, building a thick barrier that actually added another layer of insulation. The wind battered the exterior shell relentlessly, but that force no longer pressed directly against his living space. The air gap did something remarkable in heavy wind. It slowed pressure changes. Normally, when wind hits a single-wall cabin, it creates pressure differentials, tiny forces that push cold air through micro gaps in the structure. Even well-sealed homes experience this effect. That is why you sometimes feel drafts despite good insulation. But Daniel's outer wall took that pressure first. Any infiltration occurred there, not against the inner envelope. By the time air moved through the cavity, its force and temperature differential were moderated. He checked the small vent openings carefully, ensuring they weren't clogged with snow. Air needed limited movement to prevent moisture buildup, but not enough to create wind tunnels. Inside, the temperature hovered steadily, not tropical, not excessively warm, just stable. 21 degrees Celsius, while outside the wind chill dropped below -20. The town began feeling the strain. At the diner, conversations shifted from casual to concerned. My heater hasn't shut off in 2 days, someone said. I am already halfway through my stacked wood. Feels colder inside than it should. Carl listened quietly. He admitted aloud, but he felt the difference too. His cabin walls seemed to radiate cold despite the roaring stove. The fire warmed the air, but the surfaces still felt like winter. That was the difference between heating air and retaining heat within a structure. Air warms quickly, mass retains slowly. Daniel's double wall system created a buffer zone where the inner wall never fully reached outside temperature extremes. The gradient across layers was stretched, softened. On the fourth consecutive night below -15, something unusual happened. The power flickered, once, twice, then went out completely across most of town. Electric heaters shut down instantly, lights vanished. The only remaining warmth in many cabins came from wood stoves. Generators sputtered to life in some yards, but not all. Carl's cabin dimmed except for the orange glow of his firebox. He added more logs, knowing the cold would bite harder without supplemental heat. Across the road, Daniel's cabin lights also went dark, but the interior warmth remained steady. His stove burned at moderate output, not maxed out. Because his heat loss rate was slower, he need aggressive combustion to compensate. Neighbors stepping outside to assess the blackout noticed something odd. Daniel's chimney smoke remained light, not heavy, not desperate light. Is he not cold? Someone muttered. The blackout lasted 6 hours. By morning, electricity returned, but the cold did not ease. Instead, the forecast warned of a record-breaking overnight low approaching, -20. Wind sustained. The kind of temperature that tests insulation, plumbing, patience, and pride. That evening, cabins across town prepared for battle. Fires were stoked high before bedtime, faucets left dripping. Cabinet doors under sinks opened to allow warm air to circulate around pipes. Extra blankets piled on beds. Daniel prepared differently. He ensured his stove would maintain steady output, not spike. He walked the perimeter of the air gap one final time, brushing away accumulated snow blocking lower vents. He sealed one minor seam, where wind-driven powder had begun to infiltrate. Then he went inside and closed the door. The night fell brutally cold. Trees cracked in the distance, a sharp popping sound caused by frozen sap expanding. The air itself felt brittle. Even the sky looked harder, stars sharper against the black. Inside Carl's cabin, the stove burned fiercely, too fiercely. The room nearest the stove grew overly hot, while the far corners remained chilly. The temperature imbalance was uncomfortable but necessary to prevent overall drop. He woke twice in the night to feed more logs. Across town, similar scenes repeated. People rising at 2 a.m., 4 a.m., feeding fires, checking thermostats, listening to the groan of structures contracting in extreme cold. Daniel slept through most of it. When he woke just before dawn, he checked the indoor thermometer, 21 degrees Celsius. He checked the outer wall surface from inside the cavity through a small access panel. Bitter cold, but contained. The air gap, temperature set somewhere between moderated. Exactly as designed. When neighbors stepped outside that morning, their breath exploded into thick clouds instantly. Frost clung heavily to roofs and vehicles. Ice crystals formed along exposed nails and hinges. Carl stepped onto his porch, exhausted from broken sleep. He glanced at Daniel's cabin. No frantic smoke, no signs of struggle, just quiet. And something in his chest tightened not from cold but from confusion, because winter had arrived with full force. And Daniel's cabin did. It looked like it was fighting at all. It looked like it was enduring. The town had expected the second wall to fail dramatically, perhaps collapse under snow, perhaps prove useless against deep freeze. Instead, it did something far more unsettling. It worked, not loudly, not boastfully, but undeniably. And winter was only halfway through. The morning after the coldest night the valley had seen in years, the town moved slower than usual. Exhaustion hung in the air almost as heavily as the frost. Doors creaked open cautiously. People stepped onto porches and immediately pulled collars tighter around their necks. The cold did just sit outside it, pressed against skin like something alive, something persistent. Carl hadn't slept properly. His fire had needed constant feeding, even with the stove burning hot. Parts of his cabin had felt stubbornly cold. The far bedroom wall had formed a faint sheen of frost along the interior corner seam. Not dangerous, but unsettling. He stepped off his porch and looked across the gravel road. Daniel's cabin looked ordinary. Snow drifted up against the outer wall in thick ridges. The roof carried a steady white blanket. The chimney released a thin, calm stream of smoke, not the desperate billowing he had seen from others. It did make sense. Curiosity, once mixed with ridicule, now edged toward something quieter. Doubt. By late morning, Mrs. Whitaker had already spoken to 2 neighbors about the difference she'd noticed. Her heating bill from the previous week had spiked sharply. Pipes had frozen once already. She had barely kept her kitchen warm overnight despite burning extra wood. And his chimney hardly smoked, she whispered almost conspiratorially. Maybe he is just stubborn. Someone replied. But stubborn did explain stability. Around noon, when the sun rose weakly but did nothing to warm the air, Carl made a decision he would. He have made a month earlier. He walked across the road. The snow crunched loudly under his boots, brittle and dry. He knocked once on Daniel's door, firm but not aggressive. For a moment there was no sound. Then the door opened. Warm air drifted outward, not in a blast, not dramatically but enough to feel noticeably different from the biting air outside. Carl stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was heat. It was balance. The air did feel stuffy. It did feel overheated near the stove and cold near the walls. It felt even. He removed his gloves slowly. Daniel closed the door behind him. On the wall near the kitchen table, a simple thermometer displayed 101 degrees. Carl stared at it longer than he meant to. "You running that stove all night?" he asked. "Moderately," Daniel replied calmly. Carl walked toward one of the interior walls, the one that faced the outer structure. He pressed his palm against it. It felt cool but not cold. Not like his own walls had felt. "How?" he asked quietly, and this time there was no sarcasm in his voice. Daniel motioned toward a small access panel near the floor, something most people would even notice unless pointed out. He opened it carefully. Inside was the narrow cavity between the original cabin wall and the new outer wall. The air there felt colder than the room, but not violently so. It was a buffered cold, controlled. Carl leaned closer. "That space, it's not insulated solid," he observed. "No," Daniel said. "It's controlled air." Carl frowned. "Air does stop cold." "Moving air carries cold," Daniel corrected gently. "Still air slows it," he explained without lecture. No arrogance. Just clarity. "The outer wall," he said, "absorbed the brunt of wind pressure and extreme temperature. The air gap created a break in thermal conduction. The inner wall never experienced the full outside temperature directly. Heat generated inside the cabin did escape as quickly because it had to pass through multiple resistances." Carl listened, arms crossed at first, then slowly uncrossing. "And the vents?" he asked, remembering the small openings he'd mocked weeks ago. "They prevent moisture buildup and allow limited pressure equalization," Daniel replied. "Too sealed and you trap condensation. Too open and you create convection currents. It has to be balanced." Carl stood silently for a moment. Outside, wind rattled faintly against the outer shell. Inside, there was barely a sound. It was then that Mrs. Whitaker appeared at the doorway. She had seen Carl walk over and, driven by equal parts curiosity and hope, followed him. Daniel welcomed her inside without hesitation. Her reaction was more immediate. "Oh my," she breathed, stepping fully into the room. "It's comfortable." She walked toward a window, expecting frost along the interior edge. There was none. "How is there no ice on the glass?" she asked. "Because the inner wall surface temperature stays above freezing," Daniel replied. "The outer wall takes most of the drop." She touched the glass lightly, then looked back at him with something close to disbelief. Word travels fast in small towns. Within an hour, 2 more neighbors knock. Daniel did advertise. He did boast. He simply opened the door. Each person who stepped inside reacted the same way: subtle surprise first, then a longer pause as they tried to reconcile what they felt with what they believed. The stove was not roaring. The room was not overly hot. It was steady. "What is it at?" someone asked, pointing to the thermometer. 21, Daniel answered. Outside it was -20. The contrast was dramatic in appearance, but overwhelming in implication. Carl walked around the perimeter slowly, studying details. The way the outer wall did, physically connect rigidly to the inner cabin at every point, reducing thermal bridging. The way corners were reinforced, the deliberate spacing. "You planned this all before winter?" he asked. "For years," Daniel replied. That answer settled differently. This was panic building. It was paranoia. It was preparation. Mrs. Whitaker sat down at the small kitchen table, removing her coat completely now. "I barely slept," she admitted softly. "I kept waking up to feed the fire." Daniel nodded. "That is the cycle most cabins create. Heat escapes faster than it should, so you compensate." Carl exhaled slowly. He hated admitting it, but his wood pile was already noticeably smaller than this time last year. "And your wood?" he asked bluntly. Daniel gestured toward a modest stack visible through the back window. "Less than last winter so far." Silence filled the room, not uncomfortable, but heavy with realization. The second wall they had mocked as wasteful now looked like something else entirely. Efficient. The power flickered again briefly that afternoon, a reminder that winter wasn't finished testing them. But inside Daniel's cabin, The temperature barely shifted. One of the younger neighbors, curious and more open-minded than the older ones, asked, "Could this work on other cabins?" Daniel did hesitate. "Yes, with adjustments." "Is it expensive?" "Not as expensive as burning double the fuel for years." That calculation hit differently. Fuel ones, just comfort it was cost. Labor. Time. As the small group prepared to leave, Carl lingered near the door. He looked back at the inner wall one more time. "I thought you were overbuilding," he admitted quietly. Daniel met his gaze without judgment. "It looks that way." Carl nodded slowly. "I've been heating the air," he said, almost to himself. "You've been keeping it." Daniel did respond verbally, but the acknowledgement was there. When they stepped back outside, the cold hit hard again, like a reminder of reality. But now it felt slightly different. Not unbeatable. Not mysterious. Understandable. By evening, nearly everyone on the road had heard what it felt like inside Daniel's cabin. No one left anymore. Instead, questions replaced jokes. "Would you help me measure mine?" "How far out would the second wall need to sit?" "Do you think it's too late to start this season?" Daniel did promise miracles. He explained timelines, materials, structural considerations. He did act like a savior. He acted like a neighbor. That night, when the temperature dropped again, though not quite as brutally as the previous evening, something subtle shifted across town. People still fed their stoves. They still layered blankets. But the conversation had changed. The second wall was no longer a punchline. It was a possibility. Inside his cabin, Daniel sat quietly at the table, listening to the muffled wind against the outer shell. The air inside remained steady at 21 degrees, not because winter had weakened, but because design had anticipated it. And for the first time since the laughter began, the town was watching his cabin with amusement. They were watching with attention. The shift did happen all at once. No town meeting was called. No public apology was made. No one stood in the road and admitted they had been wrong. Instead, it began quietly, like most real changes do. The morning after several neighbors had stepped inside Daniel's cabin and felt the steady warmth for themselves, the usual rhythm of the street resumed. Smoke still rose from chimneys, axes still split wood, boots still crunched across frozen gravel. But there was a difference in the way people looked at the second wall now. Before, they had stared at it with amusement. Now, they studied it. Carl was the first to act. He did announce anything. He did knock on doors, asking for attention. He simply walked back into his own cabin and began looking at his exterior walls with new eyes. He pressed his palm against the interior paneling again. Still colder than Daniel. He walked outside and examined the siding, the corners, the seams, the areas where wind struck hardest. For 30 winters, he had relied on thicker fires. Now he was wondering if he had been compensating instead of improving. That afternoon, he crossed the road again, not to observe, but to ask. Daniel was stacking a small amount of fresh-cut wood near his porch when Carl approached. "If I were to build one," Carl said plainly, nodding toward the outer wall, "where would I start?" Daniel did smile in triumph. He did tease. He set down the log in his hands and stepped forward. "We measure first," he said. "Every cabin as different." Carl nodded once. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Daniel agreed. Word spread faster this time, not through mockery, but through quiet curiosity. By the next evening, Daniel had walked through 3 cabins, taking measurements and explaining airflow patterns. He carried a small notebook and pencil, sketching quick diagrams on scrap paper. He explained how the outer wall did need to be massive. It needed to be deliberate, the spacing consistent, the vents positioned carefully. "It's not about sealing everything tight," he told Mrs. Whitaker as she listened attentively. "It's about controlling how air moves." She looked around her living room, noticing drafts she had ignored for years. "I've always just turned up the heat," she admitted. "That works," Daniel said gently. "But it costs." Carl began purchasing lumber 2 days later. The sight was almost surreal. The same man who had laughed the loudest at the idea of a fortress was now unloading beams beside his own cabin. This time, no one mocked him. They watched. And when he began setting posts roughly 18 inches from his existing wall, leaving that now familiar gap, there was no laughter, only nods. The cold did ease. January remained harsh. Another wave of sub-zero nights passed through, not quite as extreme as the record low, but persistent enough to keep pressure on every home. Inside Daniel's cabin, the temperature remained steady. Inside Carl's, the change was gradual. The first week, his outer frame stood exposed, incomplete. It looked skeletal, almost like Daniel had weeks earlier. Snow drifted into the open cavity space. Wind whistled through unfinished sections. But he kept building. And this time Daniel helped. They worked side by side in the brittle morning air, breath rising in synchronized clouds. Daniel showed him how to angle vent openings, how to avoid rigid connections that would create thermal bridges, how to seal seams without over-tightening the structure. Let the walls move slightly, Daniel explained. Wood expands and contracts. If you fight that, you create cracks. Carl listened more carefully than he ever had before. Others began gathering in small groups to observe the process. Younger neighbors volunteered to help lift panels. Someone brought coffee. Someone else brought spare insulation rolls. What had begun as one man's private project slowly became communal learning. Mrs. Whitaker did. She have the strength to build her own outer wall, but her nephew drove in from a nearby town to assist after hearing about it. He had assumed the story was exaggerated until he stepped inside Daniel's cabin himself. "It's like a different climate in here," he said in amazement. Daniel corrected him softly. "Same climate, different envelope." The phrase stuck. By mid-January, 2 cabins on the road had partial secondary walls rising. By the end of the month, 4 more had plans drawn up. The transformation one's to immediate magic. Carl's cabin, once fully enclosed by the second wall, did not suddenly feel tropical, but something subtle shifted. On the first night after completion, when temperatures dropped to -14, he fed his stove, before bed but less aggressively. He woke at 3 a.m. out of habit, expecting that familiar bite of cold creeping through the far bedroom wall. It was there, not completely gone, but softened. He lay there for several minutes, listening. The wind struck the outer shell first now, rattling that barrier before touching the original structure. The sound inside felt duller, less intrusive. He got up, walked into the living room, and checked the thermometer, 19 degrees. 2 degrees lower than Daniel's, but higher than he had expected, and the stove hadn't. He needed constant feeding. The next morning, he crossed the road again, not with doubt this time, but with something close to satisfaction. "It works," he admitted. Daniel nodded, as if he had expected no other outcome. Over the following weeks, heating patterns across town began to change. Wood piles shrank more slowly. Generators ran less frequently. Electric heaters stayed off during nights that would have previously demanded them. More importantly, sleep returned. People weren't waking every few hours to stoke fires as urgently. The interior walls no longer radiated deep cold from the outside. The town's energy shifted from survival to adaptation. At the diner, conversations evolved. "Should have done this years ago," someone muttered. "It is simple when you think about it," another said. "It is not simple," Carl corrected. "It is smart." No one argued. The man they once teased had become the quiet reference point. Daniel never positioned himself as an expert. He simply shared what he knew. He lent tools. He helped measure. He reminded them that airflow mattered more than thickness alone. One evening, as snow fell steadily but gently for the first time in weeks, the road looked different. Instead of one cabin wrapped in a second shell, there were now several at various stages of completion, like the street itself had evolved. Children began referring to them as double houses. And with each new outer wall completed, the laughter that once echoed in October faded further into memory. Mrs. Whitaker's nephew finished her outer shell before February's final cold snap. That night, when the temperature dipped below -12 again, her kitchen pipes did not freeze. She noticed immediately. She sat at her small table the next morning, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and simply smiled. It was tea dramatic. It was relief. Fuel deliveries that had once been urgent became manageable. The general store owner noticed fewer emergency propane refills. Wood suppliers reported slightly reduced demand compared to early season projections. The town was suddenly warm. Winter was still winter. But it no longer felt like a battle fought in panic. It felt controlled. One afternoon, Carl stood at the edge of the road looking at the row of cabins with their new outer shells catching soft winter light. "You know," he said quietly to Daniel, who stood beside him, "we thought you were overcomplicating things." Daniel shrugged slightly. "Sometimes simple ideas look complicated." Carl nodded. "Guess we were heating the air all these years." "And losing it," Daniel replied. The irony was lost on either of them. The second wall hadn't. Just changed interior temperatures. It had changed perspective. Innovation, once mocked, had become standard practice on their road. And as February neared its end, the town realized something else. They had made it through one of the harshest winters in recent memory with fewer emergencies, fewer frozen pipes, fewer sleepless nights. Not because winter had been kinder, but because someone had prepared differently. The shift in attitude was complete. No banners were raised. No speeches given, just steady cabins, quieter stoves, and a road that no longer laughed at the sight of an extra wall. Instead, it built them. By the time March began to loosen winter as grip, the valley felt different. Not warmer, at least, not at first, but calmer. The brutal edge of January had softened. Snow still covered the ground in thick patches, and mornings remained cold enough to sting the lungs, but the sun lingered longer each day. Icicles that had hung stiff and unmoving for weeks began to drip slowly by afternoon. Roofs creaked not from deep freeze, but from gradual thaw. And along that quiet gravel road, something had undeniably changed. Nearly every cabin now carried some version of a second wall. Some were polished and symmetrical like Daniel. Others were more rugged, slightly uneven, built with reclaimed lumber or improvised supports, but they shared the same idea: space between layers, a buffer, a pause between outside and inside. The laughter from October felt distant now, almost embarrassing in hindsight. One afternoon, Carl stood beside his completed outer wall, running a hand along the wood thoughtfully. He remembered the first joke he had made, calling it a fortress. Now he caught himself calculating how much wood he had. He burned over the past 2 months. Less hauling, less splitting, fewer midnight awakenings. He hadn't expected the difference to extend beyond temperature, but it had. Winter had felt less exhausting. Across the road, Daniel was repairing a small section of vent trim that had loosened during a windstorm weeks earlier. His movements were the same as always, calm, deliberate, unhurried. Mrs. Whitaker walked up slowly, holding a small basket. "I brought you something," she said warmly. Inside were fresh rolls she had baked that morning. "You did, have to," Daniel replied. "I know," she smiled, "but we all should have listened sooner." He shook his head gently. "You listened when it mattered." That was the truth of it. The lesson hadn't been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about demonstrating something quietly and letting winter speak for itself. As the days grew slightly longer, neighbors began gathering more frequently outside without urgency. Conversations shifted from survival strategies to future improvements. What if we added roof ventilation next year? Could we do something similar for the floors? Maybe we've been thinking about our homes too simply. It was no longer just about warmth. It was about understanding. The second wall had forced the town to rethink something they had taken for granted for decades, that more heat was the only answer to cold. Now they understood something subtler. Retention mattered more than force. One evening, as melting snow created shallow streams along the roadside, a few neighbors gathered near Daniel's porch, not to inspect or measure this time, but simply to talk. Carl leaned against a post, hands in his pockets. "You ever going to say I told you so?" he asked, half grinning. Daniel laughed softly. "Would tea change anything?" Carl nodded. "You know what bothers me most," he continued. "It wasn't even complicated. We just didn't think to question what we were doing." Daniel looked out across the cabins, their new outer shells catching golden sunset light. "Tradition works," he said, "until conditions change. Then you adapt." Mrs. Whitaker tilted her head slightly. "But winter hasn't changed. It has always been cold." "Yes," Daniel replied. "Energy costs have changed. Weather patterns are shifting. Materials improve. Knowledge grows. If we don't adjust, we fall behind even if the cold stays the same." Silence followed, not heavy, but reflective. The town had survived winters before. They would survive many more. But surviving once did the same as improving. A week later, the last major freeze of the season swept through unexpectedly. Not as severe as January, but sharp enough to test what had been built. Temperatures dropped below -10 overnight. This time, there was no panic. Stoves were lit steadily but not desperately. No one rushed to check pipes at midnight. No generators roared into action. By morning, thermometers across the road told similar stories. Stable. Not identical in every cabin, but stable. The system had worked beyond a single house. It had scaled. And that realization carried weight. When true spring finally began showing itself, patches of earth emerging from beneath snow, birds returning hesitantly, the sickened walls remained. They weren't temporary solutions. They were permanent changes. One afternoon, as Daniel walked toward the edge of the river, now partially thawed and moving freely again, Carl caught up beside him. "Funny thing," Carl said thoughtfully. "All those years, I thought preparation meant stacking more wood." Daniel glanced at him. "It still does," he said, "just differently." Carl chuckled. "I used to think strength was about fighting harder," he added. "Now I think it is about losing less." That sentence lingered in the air, because that was the real lesson winter had delivered. Not that fire was unnecessary, not that tradition was foolish, but that efficiency could quietly outperform force. Weeks later, at the small town gathering held each spring in the community hall, someone mentioned the winter casually during open discussion. "Coldest in years," one man said. "Did feel as bad as I expected." another replied. Heads nodded around the room. No one explicitly credited the second walls, but the connection was understood. The general store owner even joked, might start stocking lumber year-round. Laughter followed, but this time it wasn't tea-mocking. It was proud. Daniel stood near the back of the hall, listening rather than speaking. He had never intended to lead anything. He had simply built what he believed made sense. Yet influence doesn't always require volume. Sometimes it requires patience. As the meeting ended and people filtered outside into the cool but gentle evening air, Mrs. Whitaker paused beside him. "You changed more than the temperature," she said quietly. Daniel looked at her curiously. "You changed how we think," she finished. He did respond immediately, because he knew something important. He hadn't. He changed them. Winter had. He had only prepared for it differently. The second wall had been wood and nails and measured space. But it had also been a question. What if there's a better way? That question, once laughed at, had become the foundation for something stronger than insulation. It had become perspective. Months later, when summer fully arrived and the valley turned green again, the outer walls remained in place. Some people considered painting them. Others added small shelves or decorative trim. They had stopped looking like strange additions. They simply looked like part of the home. And that was perhaps the most powerful transformation of all. What was once ridiculed had become normal. What was once doubted had become standard. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and long shadows stretched across the road, Daniel sat on his porch rocking chair. The air was mild. No frost. No urgency. Carl walked past and paused. "You planning anything else crazy?" He teased lightly. Daniel smiled. "Not crazy," he replied. "Just thinking ahead." Carl laughed and continued walking, because now, when Daniel thought ahead, no one laughed with disbelief. They listened. The winter had taught them something simple but lasting. Innovation often looks unnecessary until it isn't. And sometimes the difference between sterling and steady is nothing more than an extra layer of understanding. The cabin stood quietly under the fading light, double-walled, resilient, prepared. Not because winter had been defeated, but because it had been respected. And in that respect, town found something stronger than warmth. They found wisdom.